Hi there, it's so nice to see you all here and to be here. Good morning. I'm Carol Rifkind, a member of the Board of Directors of the Municipal Art Society. New York City's zoning resolution turns 50 this year. Zoning regulations define what our city looks like. They outline where we can live, work, play, relax, interact, experience life, art, make things, and make things happen, and make fashion. The zoning resolution has been amended countless times to reflect the changing need of our city. In this anniversary year, MAS has published an op-ed and held a thoughtful panel discussion about whether or not New York City needs a new zoning resolution for the 21st century. Today, we continue the conversation. Our panel of local and national experts will discuss the goals and principles for the zoning resolution of the future. It's my pleasure to introduce our very special panel members. We're all lucky. Our moderator, Vicki Bean, at the far, your left, works at the cutting edge of legal scholarship at the intersection of land use, urban policy, and housing. She has been on faculty at NYU Law School since 1990 and is currently the Boxer Family Professor of Law, affiliated professor of public policy, and faculty director for the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. Vicki authored one of the first major articles on the distributional fairness of environmental land use policies. Her current research focuses on the effects the mortgage foreclosure crisis has on our neighborhoods, families, and children, and on the role of zoning and other regulations in shaping development patterns. Vicki joined the MAS Board of Directors in 2009. And our panelists, next to Vicki, Donald Elliott. He's a senior consultant with Clarion Associates of Colorado, a land use consulting firm with offices across the country. Don's practice focuses on land planning and zoning, growth management, and international land and urban development issues. He's the author of A Better Way to Zone, co-author of The Citizen's Guide to Planning, and editor of the Colorado Land Planning and Development Law. Don is a past national chairman of the Planning and Law Division of the American Planning Association. Next, Michael Kortler, an architect, planner, urban designer, educator, and principal of Michael Kortler and Associates. He's also the founding president of the Environmental Simulation Center, a nonprofit research laboratory created to develop innovative applications of information technology for community planning, design, and decision-making. His professional practice and teaching have focused on urban design, good city form, the theory and practice of legislating aesthetics, and land use regulatory design. Michael was made a fellow of the American Institutes of Architects in 1990 for his work in performance zoning and developing humane zoning regulations. Next to Michael, Mitchell Silver. Mitchell is the Chief Planning and Economic Development Officer in the city of Raleigh, North Carolina, and is president of the American Planning Association. As planning director in Raleigh, he led the comprehensive plan update process. He is now overseeing a rewrite of the city's development code. Before coming to Raleigh in 2005 as planning director, Mitch worked as policy and planning director in New York City, a principal of a New York City-based planning firm, a town manager in New Jersey, and deputy director of planning in Washington, D.C. Finally, Geraldine Perrine is executive director of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council. She spearheads a high-impact agenda to improve the quality of public debate, inform public policy, promote new ideas, and engage a wide audience to improve New York City neighborhoods. Geraldine was appointed Commissioner of the Department of Housing Preservation and Development by both Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Geraldine was the author of Mayor Bloomberg's New Housing Marketplace Plan, announced in 2002, that has provided $3 billion in over 5 years to preserve and create over 65,000 units of affordable housing. Under Mayor Mayor Giuliani, she designed and oversaw the management and operation of programs designed to return a significant inventory of tax foreclosed residential property to local private ownership. So it's quite a panel, and I want to thank in advance the panelists for their participation and hand the session over to Vicki Bean. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Carol, for that very wonderful introduction. So our job today is to stir things up a little bit by taking on the question of whether we should reform the city's 1961 zoning ordinance. As Carol told you, we have a great panel, people who have worked all over the nation, all over the world, as well as people who are very firmly grounded and know the inside and out of the zoning ordinance in New York City. So as many of you know, the 1961 zoning ordinance, when it was introduced, when it was passed, was quite revolutionary in its time. And over the years, it has adopted all kinds of sophisticated tools, transferable development rights, hillside protection areas, inclusionary zoning for affordable housing, a wide range of really very interesting and useful tools. But I think the question that we need to confront today is it still workable? Can it allow us to grow? Can it allow us to build a 21st century city? Can it allow us to build a city that's just, that's equitable, that's sustainable? And so those are the questions that we hope to shed some light on today, and hope at the end of the session that you'll be thinking about your questions, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to start with the panel by asking if you could have your wish, right, and two things in the city zoning ordinance could be radically reformed, what would your priorities be? Two things. So Don, let's start with you.
My two would be to integrate environmental controls with zoning and not have this right-hand, left-hand bipolar tension between zoning and environmental and sustainability, but to integrate them. And a lot of cities around the country are doing that. And the second one is allow more by right development. Set the rules right, and admit that Kevin Lynch was right. There are places in the city that deserve intense scrutiny, and there are a lot of places that don't. Set the rules right, and let those places, the vast majority of every city, just develop by right in accordance with those rules, less negotiation.
Okay. Michael.
Well, I would add on to what Dawn said. I think there are two things. One is to really connect zoning to a strategic plan, and I'm not actually even sure what we mean by zoning at this point, because one of the places which we can talk about later is Houston, Texas, which is actually quite successful and does things in a just-in-time basis. I would add about the environmental is that it is one of the onerous parts of the process here. It makes it very difficult to be responsive to a global marketplace. And what I meant by strategic plan is, where does the city want to position itself relative to other global cities, which is where the competition is. And then the second, in terms of as of right, which I totally agree with, is that it probably should be performance-based. Rather than overly prescriptive. In other words, what performance does is it outlines what the problem is in advance. It's value-based and tends to have a much longer shelf life than regulations that are based on basically legislating the solution in the body of the regulations.
Okay, and we'll come back to all of these themes. Mitch?
I would say first, well, let me start off by saying that the zoning code probably shares something we all share. And the zoning code is a boomer. And I think, like all boomers, I think it's time to start to go on to its next life and make room for the next generation, which really is about innovation. I think we need to take a hard look at our codes and see how we can start moving some of the building codes, because zoning was intended to protect the public health, safety, and welfare, that is better suited in a building code. And I think the zoning code tries to do the wrong job. So certainly I would look at mixing of uses. We regulate the mix of uses far too often. When I look at the M15B and NoHo and how dynamic that is, it is limited to so many places, and I would love to see more freedom and innovation about the mixing of uses and not worrying about what use needs to be one another. So that is one. Number two, rules don't always excite people for designers to generate innovation, and if in fact our boomer code at the age of 50 is part of the silver tsunami and needs to move on to its next life. Let's talk about the millennial generation and innovation and how our code can start to inspire innovation about what we'd like to see and not a code that is telling us what we don't like to see. So to me, I'm hoping over the next 10 years, I'd love to see mix of uses and have a code that innovates and inspires and not just a document that dictates rules and regulations about what you cannot do, but what you can do.
Okay, great. We'll come back to that. Geraldine?
I think whatever form our zoning regulation takes, it should be held to the same standard that a lot of our other regulatory framework is held to, which is we should be able to say to people what the cost of these things are in this regulatory landscape, because right now you can't really figure that out very easily. So we zone things, we restrict things, we create another regulatory layer, and no one ever thinks about the resources that go into actually carrying that out, both the private sector response, but also the public sector response, and the burden on the agencies that then have to actually enforce it, because no regulation has any meaning without meaningful enforcement. But there's never any kind of weighing of what the cost of that enforcement is. So if you're, killing the fly with a nuclear bomb, that may not be exactly the right thing. And we may not really need zoning to make us, eat broccoli or ride bikes. And, there's cost to making those decisions. The second thing is actually a small thing, and in some ways technical, and it sort of goes to the heart of some of the work of Citizens Housing and Planning Council, which is that I think the word family should be eradicated from the zoning resolution. Housing is more my field, and we've got a housing framework that basically dictates not just how many people, but who lives in places. And that's reflected in the zoning resolution. And I think to some very negative consequences.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to something that, that Michael mentioned. I mean, it's interesting that all around the country, a lot of cities are redoing their comprehensive plans, and of course, the law actually requires that zoning be in accordance with the comprehensive plan. New York is famous in part because Sylvia Deutsch, then chairwoman, once held up the zoning ordinance and said, "This is our plan," in response to criticisms that we didn't have planning. So, Michael, you mentioned strategic planning, but that's not the same thing as comprehensive planning necessarily. Right. So should we go back and actually do a comprehensive plan, or is it good enough to have that be part of or incorporated into the zoning ordinance? And if so, how do we do that well? Right? So let's start with you, Michael.
Okay.
What did you mean?
What I meant by doing a comprehensive plan for a city like New York, forget the politics of doing something like that, probably makes very little sense. Because as a global city, it's the dynamics of what's going on in the rest of the world will really affect parts of the city that really need to be responsive to those kinds of changes. Mm-hmm. So I think you're thinking about doing strategic plans for various locations in the city, the places where change is slow versus where change is actually encouraged. You're looking at infrastructure, and so it sets a context for where density goes, where the increased population where the city is supposed to grow, where that population grows in some kind of very rational way. Mm-hmm. And then connecting it to things like Plan NYC and sustainability and environmental and energy concerns. And all of these are really strategic, and that they would guide the resolution. At the neighborhood level, I think there's the issue of fair share. Mm-hmm. And when the 197A plans, which are basically zoning plans, are not really plans. It doesn't take into account the idea that there really is fair share and responsibility, that we're all in this together, all of these community boards not separately trying to optimize themselves, and recognize about what happens along cross borders and where things need to go, and then actually localize that decision potentially and say, if this is what I'm supposed to do, this amount of affordable housing and transitional housing, et cetera, and here are the criteria for locating them, it's your responsibility to figure out where they go and how you do it. And I think that by involving people in making those kinds of decisions, you actually, A, inform them as to how complex the world is, and B, it builds a kind of level of civic participation and the civic culture, which I think to some degree we have really lost in a way over the last 20 years.
Well, let me turn to Mitch. Mitch, you've done some changes in Raleigh's comprehensive plan, right? And so is New York right that we don't actually need a comprehensive plan? We can get by with strategic planning or more sporadic or more targeted, I should say, planning?
You certainly can get away with a targeted approach, but I think it's more important for a variety of reasons to do a comprehensive analysis and a plan. Well, why is that? To me, a comprehensive plan really should share the public's vision and values for how it's going to grow. You need to have a conversation about the emerging trends, but more importantly, our plan, all departments said it was the Department of City Planning's plan. And we said, no, it is the city's plan, it's the public's plan, and we engage in a conversation with other departments who did not talk to one another. A city is a complex systems and people living together, and we had to make sure we had a common vision and values, and then we coded for it. Without that, you kind of code for a sustainability initiative, or you code for how do we merge land use and transportation better. But we scientifically did an analysis. We knew how many households were going to grow, how many jobs we needed, how many space, and then we took our city and made sure that we can adapt to the future changes of an aging population, of dealing with social equity. The public bought in. Actually, 96% of the public bought into our comprehensive plan, and now is making our coding process. We're now coding for that vision and values, and now that is moving through. So to me, it's important, one, as a device that you're all on the same page. It's going to vary from neighborhood to neighborhood. Most neighborhoods are not going to see change. Most of the action are in those places where we see evolving over time, and that's where we're spending most of our attention, and it's exciting. But we're doing this together. We understand what we're solving, and we understand what we're coding for. So I believe it will be beneficial. I know Chicago and New York didn't get the memo on accordance to the plan, and I was actually there when Sylvia Deutsch lifted it up and said, this is the plan, and I'm a young student. Really? I didn't know that. But I think we need to share vision and values, have that conversation, and code for it.
Geraldine, from your perspective as a former commissioner of housing, what do you think about Mitch's argument? We need a planning process to get the agencies to talk to each other, to get the public to buy in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, I actually am a planner, but it sort of gives me a headache to think about it in New York, because we're sort of very schizophrenic about planning in New York. We don't like it, but we all want to have something to say about what happens that's important to us, you know? So, and then we call it planning, and we say we want that. But, you know, no community ever says, I would like the mound of salt, I would like the homeless shelter, you know, I would like the bus depot. So, you know, the work of planners is usually pretty thankless. So I'm not sure, I mean, I guess I kind of agree with Michael. I'm not sure the idea of a comprehensive plan. I think it would become like a giant, we would need like giant therapy. We would need like psychiatrists, not planners, to run it. And, you know, maybe we should do that. I mean, maybe we should just bite the bullet, you know, and turn to the Department of Health and Mental Health and just ask them to take over this part of our government for us and our public engagement. But I do think that we have to have some basic principles, which I think we say we do, but we don't really, right? So we talk about things like, well, we want to balance, yes, we're interested in sustainability, but if you're in a historic district, we want you to put, you know, 3/3, you know, wooden panes that, you know, blah, 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 aren't very energy efficient, whatever, or are made in like Paris and cost $30,000. So we're kind of schizophrenic about what we want and what the priorities are. And I think we have to figure out some way, and maybe it's more Michael's way, maybe it could be Mitch's way, I don't know, to just sort of say, we really are serious about sustainability. And so that means that, yeah, maybe in every historic district, somebody's going to have to get, you know, modern triple pane glass windows that are made of metal. And oh my God, you know, is that going to be the end of our civilization?
Carry right there, you know? In the middle of the
So, you know, and I just feel like we keep sort of running to different ends of the boat. You know, we want to preserve landmarks. We want to have, you know, the two words that I would like to strike from anybody in the public sector from using are balance and context, because it's like, oh dear God, what does that even mean, you know? It basically means you can sort of trade off anything for anything, and anything that's there is better than anything that might be imagined in the future. And I think these are bad things for New York, and it really doesn't set us up very well in terms of a global city, which is, you know, something, I mean, you know much more about than I, but I mean, when you go to sort of some of the great cities of the world, they are innovating in ways that I feel like we're really not here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Don, let me turn back to you. What about this question of comprehensive planning, and especially of getting the environmental and the zoning on the same page? Getting the environmental regulation and the zoning on the same page?
Well, I guess Mitch has done a notable job in Raleigh, and he used planning, I think, the way it's supposed to be used. How much are we going to grow with what kinds of people, and what are they going to make, so we can design and code for it? That is admirable. And Vancouver's doing the same thing. Vancouver has had a discussion for 5 years or more that said, we need to double the density in this city. How are we going to do it? And they've engaged their bright minds. So they're doing it right. If I said that in Denver, I would be shot. You know, if I said a 10% increase, I'd be shot. We're not going to do that. Somehow, they've got a planning process that says, we know we're growing, we know we're aging, we know it's what are we going to do, and they plan for it. Having said all that, I don't think you need a plan. I'm a planner. And 50% or more of the places I write zoning codes for do not have a plan. Mm-hmm. Very frequently, they use the zoning reform process to build momentum to figure out what they ought to be planning for. It's so broken that they need to fix it so badly. In the process of fixing it, which I maintain you can do without a plan, you can figure out what needs to be broken. The builders will tell you. The citizens will tell you what's broken. You can fix it without a plan. In the process, you'll figure out those areas, those strategic areas, or those policies, or those environmental issues that you really do need to plan and study for so that you can set a guide for the future. But in my world, the problem is not that we don't have plans. The major problem I deal with is that people know what they want. Their zoning never comes into alignment with it. So I try to work on the fact that you're fixing zoning to do what you know you want to do. If you have time and money to plan, you should. I'm a planner. I learned that in school. But if you don't have time and money to do it, that should not be an excuse not to fix the things you know are broken.
So let's talk about fixing the things that you know are broken. So one thing that we know is broken, or there seems to be pretty wide agreement is broken, is the environmental review process, right? Mm-hmm. Doesn't get the environmental issues and the zoning issues, the transportation issues, all of those things on the same page. Doesn't provide planning, right, because it's reactive rather than planning. So how could one, just in terms of reforming New York City zoning ordinance, how could one reform the environmental impact review process? Quickly, efficiently, you know, at minimal cost, how could we do that?
I'll give you two examples. One came from Duluth, where we rewrote the code a few years ago, and they got it done. But in the process, the state of Minnesota came out with major new environmental requirements that, frankly, a bunch of engineers in Minneapolis and St. Paul came up with. They didn't know how to do it. It was engineering speak for how to keep water clean and keep it from running downhill too fast. They didn't know how to do it. They just wanted to know. We had to sit there, and the short answer to your question is we paid engineers and planners a good bit of money to sit there and force the state to say, what would satisfy you on that? What would, in a zoning language, what could we approve that would satisfy you without having to do a study each and every time as to whether or not it was satisfying stormwater regs? And then write the zoning to set that as a baseline. So you just kind of eliminate as much of the individual study as you have to. In Washington State, we rewrote codes for Bainbridge Island, which is a small community, but they have a shoreland rule. Then they have a State Growth Management Act, and then they've got an environmental protection review process, and then they have zoning, and then they have subdivision. And one of the major things is to get everybody in the room and say, What are the thresholds of development that we could set in common among these different bodies of law so that when you've satisfied one, you have satisfied at least part of the elements of the other, and we don't have to talk about it anymore, to align the zoning with the thresholds that are going to actually operate in those environmental areas?
Mitch, how about what you've done in Raleigh? Have you made improvements in the environmental impact review process?
It was easy. We don't have it in North Carolina, and we don't have it in Raleigh.
Okay.
We don't have it in Colorado either.
The sky is not falling.
Yes. So
What
tell us.
we have done, because I've worked in New York City and know seeker and seeker, is that we will embed the rules in the code and don't have this separate process. It is costly. It is time consuming, and if you measure the matrix, I don't know if we're actually getting the value that we're seeking. All of our regulations are embedded within our code, so when you come in, you understand what is needed, and we evaluate it on an annual basis. And staff is charged with if a rule does not make sense, bring it to my attention, we either reform it or get rid of it. We do look at implications. That is embedded in our review process. And so we take good care of the environment. It's a place that we cherish. So we just don't have it for federal projects. We have the NEPA. But when it comes to state and local, we have staff that will run traffic analysis, will look at displacement issues. That is done through the process. It's just not a costly, time-consuming, and we can get development from the time it's brought in until permitting in less than 6 months.
Michael, I would hazard a guess that environmental impact review has done some brain damage for you over the years, right?
Brain
not
damage.
Not that you're showing any signs of it, Michael. That's not what I meant. But what's your view about that proposal? Basically, we figure out what we need to do. It's along the lines of performance zoning in a certain way, right?
Exactly.
We figure out what we need to do. We change the thresholds. So one cost of that is the kind of individualized, project-specific, little details or little differences between projects that might get lost in that kind of a threshold.
I think it's a question of close enough is good enough. And I think that's what Dawn was saying.
Yep.
And given a city of this size, and my experience with EISs is that it's basically a disclosure document, the way it's used in New York. We missed the planning part of it, where in California it's required at the beginning of the process, so at least you use it to design the project. I agree with both Don and Mitch that a lot of this, particularly if it's performance-based, and it goes back, performance is value-based, which is, this is what people actually think, and then it's up to somebody else to figure out how you respond to it, so there are multiple right answers. It inspires creativity. It doesn't pre-mediate the design in the regulations. But the idea of one is moving up the process so that it's at the beginning, and also eliminating, I think, a lot of it by embedding it in the regulations themselves. I think it's interesting that the panel is mostly talking about a code rather than a zoning ordinance. And that probably includes historic preservation. I'm working in Providence. They're all part of their land development code, taking parts of the building code and parts of what's in the zoning resolution and putting it in the building code. And then there are just parts of it that absolutely make no sense. I mean, we still have tanneries as a use group. Gives you an idea.
So did Philadelphia till
Yes.
last year.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the issues that environmental impact review raises, though, is that it's an opportunity for public participation, right? It's an opportunity for, or allegedly, it's an opportunity for public participation, and of course that's a major issue whenever we're talking about zoning. So how could we allow for, indeed encourage, the kind of public participation that we want without having it be basically a stopping mechanism?
Well, one is I think the EIS, environmental impact statements, are kind of like fodder for the legal industry in New York. They are basically designed to fend off legal challenges, and they're written, and very much written that way. A lot of, I think what we're all talking about is finding out what people's values are, what things really sustain them in advance, putting those in the code. And that's really where they sign off. It's at the beginning, not really noodling every project that gets built in a city. And also, if you think about it, substituting my judgment for your judgment or anybody else's judgment as to what good design is, if that was the case, we wouldn't have most of the really interesting stuff in New York City if it had gone through design review. No Guggenheim Museum, no Whitney Museum, no Empire State Building. It's out of context, it's out of scale, you know, in the neighborhood. And things like that. So, you know, and I could give you a big litany of all of the things that we all know and love in New York that would never have made it through design review. In fact, actually can't even be built under the current set of regulations, and they're all desirable. So if one could reach consensus on what the core values are as Mitch describes them, and then put all of this and blend all of the regulations that deal with a piece of land into one code, rather than having them as competing locations where you can go around and shop for the best deal, which is also what goes on, where preservation really substitutes for planning if you don't get a good deal out of city planning. I think you could do all of this, but it needs to be really performance-based. And the idea of figuring out in advance what should go on every piece of land in New York City for the indefinite future is just goofy. I mean, I can't even get through my calendar during the week, no less figure out what 8 million people are going to be doing to optimize their own relationships with their neighbors, their own well-being, and so on.
But can I just say, but I think too, Michael, that we, just going back to my psychiatry plea, I think we have to be honest about what we intended these regulations to do. I mean, the environmental process that Mitch, you're describing is one that sounds to me like it actually cares about the environment. You know, I mean, our environmental review process doesn't really do that. I mean, it doesn't affect every site. It doesn't, you know, it's about tying development to a standard and a level of hoops that it has to go through before it can happen. So in essence, our environmental review process, if you think about it, is there to preserve whatever horrible environment currently exists. You know, it's not there to encourage change that might actually improve things. So, you know, very much in New York, I think we have a sense about our regulations. The thing that we love most about them is that they slow down the government, which is often a good idea. Gives our view of public participation is to allow people to stop something from happening, right? So, and I think, you know, landmarks is a good example of this. I mean, do we do a survey of every building in New York and come up with the most important landmarks and landmark them? Not really. We kind of landmark the things that somebody wants to develop, and then other people get angry about it, and then they complain and they go to landmarks and they get something landmarked, and then the development stops. So maybe that's how you save your landmarks, but you know, I'm guessing that that's not actually what that process is really designed to do. And I think we've kind of trained the public to sort of have an argument, you know, not to have sort of a thoughtful dialogue. And I think when there's been some experimentation, you know, like around discussions of Lower Manhattan, for example, I think you see kind of that people are actually kind of hungry for a discussion and maybe not an argument, but all of our regulatory framework from zoning to the building code is about teaching people how to have an argument.
Well, so how could we achieve that kind of public participation that's really, let's agree on our values, let's agree on where we want the city to go, let's write it into the code, let's have as of right, not stopping type of public participation. How could we get started on that?
I think that, go ahead, Mitch. Go ahead.
It's important to set the context for the public and not look at this zoning code as this document that comes from heaven like the 10 Commandments, like the 1916 and 61 zoning code, which is so sacred it can't be touched, that, you know, it should serve the community's needs and shouldn't be a document full of regulations, but give life to a better city and not zone for what you don't want to see, but really start talking about what you do want to see. You need to talk about where this city is going, how you're growing, what neighborhoods will be preserved and what will experience change. How does it adopt or adapt to a 21st century generation that's going to use space very differently. Can unit sizes change? Why are we so rigid and about how we regulate our city to create and encourage that innovation? So I would really have a conversation to set the term. We have Plan NYC, but where is the city going in the 21st century? In fact, people living today will see the 22nd century. And so we should have a conversation about where are we headed, what kind of city we want to see, how do we deal with those in terms of social equity that can't enjoy some of the benefits of all New Yorkers, but also I think more about this entire region, how New York City doesn't just serve this city, but serve the entire region. So you have to set the terms of the conversation and then engage in that conversation, that vision and values. And you craft that zoning code in a way that serves your needs and not this rigid framework that was passed down from the zoning gods from on high.
Don?
I think there are two things. One is, and I firmly believe this, even in places that are pretty unregulated, like Colorado, like most of the country between the coasts, that don't have a layer upon layer of regulation, when new layers are added, I'm sorry to say this, but they feed NIMBYism. They are used as additional ways to stop things that you should have known about months ago, but you were asleep watching television. Now it's hit the papers and you want to stop it. So you use these layers of control to stop things that you could have been involved in up front, but it wasn't important. You read about it, you didn't think it would happen. Now it's happening. So I really think, I advise people, and most cities are doing this, depoliticize the last parts of your process. Once you get behind a certain age, there are no public hearings over the specific process. Now there's a role for design review. I think it is A, very big buildings, and B, buildings that are much bigger than what they are next to, basically. When you're really out of scale, there ought to be something to look at that, basically. But other than that, if it's a routine development, take the public hearings and the public. If you're going to say that you can't talk at the end of the process, when the builder has already followed the rules and invested a lot of time and money based on what you told him he was going to do, then you got to have better involvement up front. And the cities that I know that are doing it best set up an annual process by which they educate every year a new crop of citizen activists. I know cities that make their planning commission go to this every year. They invite the city council. They can't make the city council, but they invite them. Candidates for elected office come every year. And they do it 5 or 6 nights a year, every year, to try to raise the level of discussion. And part of the discussion is this: when do you get your values into the decision making? Answer: early, not late. Early when you set the plan, early when you set the rules, the incentives, the bonuses, the baselines, not when you don't like the look of the balconies on something that's happening down the block from you. So you ramp, and the good news is it's cheap. It takes coffee and donuts for a bunch of people in a room 5 nights a week. You got to do it every year. Philadelphia is just in the process of creating that. They came up with that in the course of redoing their code. They came to the conclusion that education was a big, regular, repeated education to raise the level of discussion was part of how their zoning system had to work. And so they've created a Citizens Planning Institute that they're trying to institutionalize as part of how they do it.
Can I add on that? I think one of the issues for a lot of people is that they never know what they're getting, or at least that's what they say. And if we're talking about a value-based approach where it's done up front, the issue is for a lot of people, and this is where the form-based stuff comes in, is it's highly predictable. It may not be particularly terrific, it may not be wonderful, it may not even be appropriate, but it is predictable. I think there's a real role in the use of information technology, visual simulations, impact analysis simulations, policy simulations. These tools are out there, and there are ways to actually inform the public discussion. And you talked about education. I think that, in my experience, the most important thing that you could do is engage the public in an intelligent conversation of taking complex issues and making them sensible. The Environmental Simulation Center has spent 20 years trying to do this with Community Viz and any number of tools that are actually really very helpful. So, and the tools are really useful in a number of ways. One is to help people frame choices intelligently, and then 2 is to have actually an intelligent conversation about planning and urban design issues. In other words, provide a vocabulary so that we actually can talk to each other. Dan Chemist from Montana always describes public hearings as public screamings. That's basically what we do. And then we sue. And this is a way in which can we all get on the same base. And actually, when you look at an image, it's very compelling, and you go, and now why don't I like it? Why do I like it? And what is that discussion? And what are the underlying values? Because very often design is used really as a way to conceal really more difficult and complex issues in a society, like affordable housing, social equity, all of those things. And they become design issues. So it actually takes design away. You can strip the facade off buildings and say, okay, now we're not talking about a design, we're talking about massing and so on. But I think that there's a real role for this that would help the public really understand what the issues are without dumbing them down to things like building height, you know.
So we've mentioned several times performance zoning, form-based zoning. Arguably, some of the city's recent rezonings that form contextual zones have some aspects of form-based zoning to them. So let's talk for a minute about, should we be moving more in that direction, and is the city doing that in an effective way in its contextual zones? Carolyn, let's start with you.
Well, you know, I mean, I hate this idea of contextual, right? This idea, just this idea that what's there should dictate what could be there in the future. The other problem I have with so much emphasis on this idea of contextual zoning, and actually the rezonings that have been done, and you know, your work, which has kind of shed a lot of light on what the impact of the rezonings have really been. But basically, the lens gets placed on the places where development can happen, either because there's a hot market for it and people are trying to stave off something, or because the government, for lots of good reasons, like redevelopment of brownfield sites, you know, is trying to draw development to these places. I mean, that leaves out a lot of the city, right? And it completely leaves out communities that are struggling with their land uses on the ground, and there's no solution for them in this debate about contextual and upzoning and downzoning, because the developers are not coming there. You know, developers, you know, they're not going to Highbridge, right? So, you know, what's happening in places like Highbridge, which is a relatively dense community in the Bronx with mostly large multifamily buildings, very underserved for retail. So what you're seeing now are, you know, and a lot of people that, you know, aren't tremendously mobile to be able to get places. So you're seeing ground floor residential units being turned into little grocery shops where people are selling out of the first floor window, you know, and so you could buy, you know, bread and milk and, you know, potato chips, whatever you want. And of course, it's completely illegal. But, you know, instead of just kind of looking at communities like that and saying, well, how can we help to bring the uses that obviously they need to this community? How can we make that happen, you know? But because it's not about development interest and the reaction to it, which is, you know, sort of what Michael's talking about, it just doesn't really get addressed. And so we have just large parts of our city that are kind of being left to fend for themselves and hope that the regulating agencies never come by. Or maybe they'd like them to come by, but they're not going to. So I think the idea of contextual does a lot of damage, actually, both in terms of stopping innovation in places where development could occur, but also in just drawing too much attention to the development-focused parts of our city.
Mitch?
We are in the process of redoing our development code right now. Now it's easy because we went through the comprehensive planning process, and so it's almost sliding through. But we're looking at the code very differently. We want to look at how it strengthens our economy and how it builds an experience for our residents and businesses. So in the planning department, we call ourselves experience builders, not regulators. So when we look at our code, we are doing a form-based approach. It's a hybrid. We're actually calling it context-based. But we're trying to give that predictability with flexibility, which is that sweet spot so many developers are looking for. We're regulating the frontage. There's a frontage type, and then there's a transition on the rear of the property, how you address your neighbors, and then we give you freedom in between. We give you a height limit. We're not worried about the bean counting of housing units. If they want to mix uses within limitations, go ahead and do it. And so we're allowing that freedom of letting developers just give us the public realm, how you need to meet the street, transition to your neighbors, and what you do in between is less of our concern. However, if you want to be innovative, then you will come through a design review process that will allow you to do something. So we're not discouraging innovation. Most codes say we love innovation, we love mixed use, but our code says you can't do it. And that's what has to change. It has to really adapt to be a lot more innovative. And so far it's getting a lot of good reaction across the board from developers and the community because now it's predictable, but it gives the developers the flexibility that they're looking without going through the process all over again. So the form does, people understand 5 stories, they don't know 40 units to the acre, what that looks like. And so we're helping them through that process by talking about form, but allowing it to be flexible. So we actually have a zone for the frontage, then you have a use that is flexible, mixed use. We're going to no more commercial districts. It's residential, mixed use, and industrial. We take away the commercial entirely. It's all mixed use in between. And then we have a transition to the rear, which gives everyone flexibility. And we went throughout the neighborhoods. We had them test it, and now they have a comfort level. And that looks like the model that's going to go forward. Right rules, right places is what we call it.
So 2 things we might draw, many things we might draw from that, but let me single out 2, right? One is maybe in the areas like High Bridge, Geraldine, we should just, anything that's not now mixed use should be mixed use, right? That's one of your first principles, Don?
Yeah, I'm with Mitch on this. The whole center of the zoning spectrum, I predict, in 10 years will be mixed use. It just is.
So that'd be, one approach, right? Everything that's not now mixed use, that's residential only, should be made mixed use to address the kinds of issues that Geraldine is posing. Second is what happens in the building stays in the building, right?
The Vegas principle.
Right, the Vegas principle. So, as Mitch is saying, we regulate what the people on the street see about that building, either from the front or the back or the sides. Right. But how many units go in that building, what size they are, all of those kinds of things, that's up to the developer. Right?
But I would point out that in my experience, that's not normally what happens in many cities. They add, when they say form-based, and I'll say this, planners are like bankers or developers, they're like sheep. They read it in Planning Magazine and they want it. And often it becomes very prescriptive. Well, the deal originally was we'll get more prescriptive on form and lighten up on uses. 2/3 of them that I see, they got more prescriptive on form and they didn't lighten up on uses. So now life is harder than it was before. The building fits in, but nobody gained any flexibility. They never got the payoff that they were doing. So I think Mitch's approach is, I think both of these are exactly right. It's very easy to lighten up on uses, and frankly, every client I have has paid us to simplify, combine, and allow a lot of flexibility in what changes from one decade to another within this building. And the second issue is exactly as you say. When you say form-based, figure out what elements of form really matter. I think you've got good ones. The facing of the street, the transitions to the neighbors. It's not the detail, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the history to the future of the city, despite what the architects say. Most of the remainder doesn't matter. So be careful. And in many cities, they look at it and they say, like Duluth. Duluth said, we want a form-based code, and we talked it through, and they said, did we say we want one? We don't want one, actually. We don't. We have 5 places in the city that we want form. We were thinking the waterfront, but we weren't thinking out in the end. We don't need it out there. We need it here, 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 and here. So they get a hybrid code. And I think that's, after reflection, most cities go that route. Mitch has done a great job in Raleigh, but that's not the norm to redo it all with form and apply it to the whole city.
So we've heard, we've talked about 2 ideas for taking things out of the zoning ordinance that really shouldn't be there. What's going on within the buildings and how the people within the buildings can constitute themselves. Let's get rid of the family definitions. Right. Let's get rid of the family ordinances. Anything else that we ought to just say, this doesn't belong
Home
in the zoning.
occupation.
Home occupation, that was my
Pardon?
understanding.
Well,
Home occupation.
Home occupation.
I mean, and I think the general approach is anything that happens within the building, which is a negotiation between the people who live there and either the owner or their fellow cooperators or condominium owners, is their business. There is nothing unsafe about having a business on the same floor as an apartment, if people in the building agree to it. This happens all over Europe, and you can't say that somehow Paris is not as nice as New York, which does prohibit this. The other places, I think, have to do with some of the, what I would call exterior furniture design, which is, flowers in your front yard and a whole bunch of other things like that, which, first of all, the building department never really will enforce. It requires a kind of vigilante approach to enforcement, which is your neighbors tell on you, which doesn't really build for a nice community spirit, if that's what it is. And it also is an incredible waste of everybody's energy writing all of this, taking it through a public review process, getting this thing adopted, going to 60 some odd community boards and so on. Is this really very efficient? I would disagree a little bit about the application of form-based, and I think there is a distinction between form-based and context-based. A context-based approach basically does a analysis, and you could do this now in CAD because all the software does it, of what's around you. And that individualized approach says, this is your context. But it's part of a larger series of other issues, sustainability, open space, security and safety, and a variety of other things that are a series of trade-offs that you can't really say in advance that these are more important than that and so on, but that you trade them off. And that would allow for change over time. What current zoning doesn't do is when the new building gets built, it's ignored. Well, the new building then should be part of the context, and so over time, the context can evolve. So if the idea is to moderate the rate of change, and I think that may be the case in a lot of more stable neighborhoods, that's really one way to do it. Typically form-based or the so-called context-based here in the city is forever. And not only that, but my experience in a mature city is we don't have regular sites, and it's a kind of one-size-fits-all to form. It isn't really context-based, because when you look at the new buildings, you go, what do these have to do with the context in most situations?
I do want to add something, and I don't know if Geraldine wanted to jump in, but let me just say we believe in public health. I think we all say that. Yet, I think it's time to put our code on a major diet. The nip and tuck approach for the 50 years is not going to work. Our challenge in Raleigh was to cut our code by at least a third. Now, the zoning resolution, well-intentioned, 3 volumes. You can use it to work out if you want to. Actually, it'll make you lose weight rather than the code going on a diet. But if you said you had 100 pages to rewrite New York City's zoning code, what would you do? What is most important to communicate how to build a city of the future in 100 pages? We're slimming ours down. The graphics are different, the message is different, the intent is different. And so because there's limitations of all these special interests and special overlay districts to address what Don was saying, it's like the palate is just there. You can just eat all the junk food and just gain weight over 50 years to satisfy everybody, because why say no to a good meal? But if you limited yourself to 50 pages, 100 pages, just as an exercise, what is most important about how you're going to build the city of tomorrow? Take those items that don't belong in your zoning code and put them in the building code, because all those life safety, what does zoning really do about public health, safety, and welfare besides light, air, and a few other things? All that could be handled by your building code, but we've stuffed them in and gave us this illusion. It's more about public welfare, and the aesthetics and appearance and character is where codes have really evolved. And we're kind of fooling ourselves to think that we're really, the intent is to protect the public health, safety, and welfare, which is the intent of every zoning code. We have to rethink the next generations of coding. The new urbanists have thought about form-based. It's a great new invention, but I think there's something left for us to do about the next generation of codes. And I think if we limit ourselves to 100 pages, talk about what's more important, and then code for it after we understand the vision and value of our city of the future.
Okay, I want to leave some time for questions, but let me just, because we're trying to generate ideas here about reform. So I'm going to come back to I mean, you've given us, you started with 2. Now I'm going to ask you to, if you could take the City Planning Commission anywhere in the world and show them something that you would like to see happen in New York City through its zoning code, what would that be? Geraldine, let me start with you.
You know, Tokyo. You know, Tokyo, and again, you know, this isn't to say that we should be Tokyo, right? But, you know, here's a city that's got incredible constraints in terms of land and population, right? And its ability to just literally house their population. It's huge challenges for them. And, you know, basically their #1 priority is earthquake safety, right? So that's what their codes focus on. Within that, you pretty much could build, you know, whatever there's a rational market for, as long as you're doing it in accordance with their earthquake codes. And, you know, it's not a question of whether you think Tokyo is sort of a good place or a bad place. I think it's a pretty great city that reflects the needs of its population, right? And its population's social values and whatever. You know, obviously there's lots of innovations, what we would consider innovations around space in terms of minimum unit size and things like that. But what you really see is this kind of ability to innovate on land in very kind of interesting ways. And it's hard for me to imagine how we stopped being the city of innovation. I mean, and this is, which is not to blame it on the zoning resolution. I mean, that's,
Although that probably helped.
that's not really fair. But we have created this fear of change and this kind of love of context. And I think it's hurting us in terms of innovation. And you look at a city like that. So we should all go to Tokyo.
All right, sounds good.
The trend right now is development service centers. Henderson, Sacramento, Raleigh, we just did ours about 2 years ago. It's merging your planning, your building, all your development services into one shop becomes seamless. And the goal is to be innovative on how you deliver these solutions. One intake center, fast track permitting, getting all departments working and collaborating together, fire, all the buildings, zoning, all together with the goal of being more innovative on delivering better products, but it's all handled into one center where now the enforcers and regulators and planners and zoners all have to talk together and collaborate and innovate together on how to produce a better city. So Sacramento, Henderson, and Raleigh are just 3 examples. There are others.
Michael?
I would take the Planning Commission to Houston, Texas, because they don't have zoning. And what's interesting, because we've done some work in Houston, is that Houston's much more performance-based, and it's also about self-organization. Things happen when there's a market for them and when the folks decide it's going to happen. There's a fabulous street called Westheimer, which was a bunch of small houses, mostly bungalows, which over a period of time developed into the funkiest commercial street in all of Houston, and people drive to this neighborhood to get out of their car and walk around. Like most planning, the planning kind of followed the actions of the individuals, which is basically what Kevin Lynch was talking about in the image of the city. And then they self-organize into organizations and so on in order to make all of this work. As a New Yorker, this is really fascinating because we don't do this kind of thing here. We do block associations and then they sue everybody, which is really what we do here. So I think that there's really a lot to learn, and also that, frankly, Houston, Texas does a lot of planning, more planning than we do here in New York, interestingly enough, that each neighborhood has neighborhood plans which are taken seriously. They allocate money and use urban design to really regulate the kind of form of the location. They do what I would call just in time. They have a very, going to your point, a very, very low what do you call it, backlog of regulation, and they're able to respond very quickly to situations. And also they have actually no sticks to give out anymore. It's all rather carrots, because they will actually process everything guaranteed within 1 month, which seems to be a pretty reasonable thing to do. I'm working in Providence now, And they also guarantee that, including what we call pre-certification, which is the period in which they kind of crush you to death for about 2 to 3 years. And that's done in 60 to 90 days, guaranteed.
Okay. Okay, Don, we're going to give you the last word, but one thing that would be for sure is that wherever you're taking the Planning Commission, they should be on their way reading your books. So hold up your book so that everybody everybody should read this book. And but the Planning
It actually has a zoning map of New York City on the cover.
Okay,
right? So there you go.
So where do you want to take?
Oh, I'd take them to Vancouver because I think for 2 reasons. It's a different city, of course, but they have very, very serious land constraints. And like Tokyo, they have decided that they're going to do difficult things in the face of reality, what is really going to happen to our city and what our choices are here. And because as a Canadian and less litigious culture, they have figured out how to integrate their environmental and their land use controls much better. They don't view it as right hand, left hand. We whack you over here, then we whack you over there. They put them together, and so I think you'd learn more about the attitude about how we try to integrate them. That's what I would do.
Okay, so I left 9 seconds. So can you make your way to the, or can you yell? I can yell. Okay, yell and I'll repeat.
I was once very active in the landmarking of the theater district in New York. A lot of us were, and we worked very hard at it. And you all can't see, but behind you there's the competition for lunch hour and over. But that crane there, which is one of those new arcing zones that was dragged, is moving now. And that is what the 90-story building, which is on the north side of 57th Street.
Mm-hmm.
A huge block of the building, and I understand, quote, it's going to be multi-use, and they say it's like this book or something. But the thing about it is that I understand it and the 29-story building to the south of it are only going to be like this because we wonderful people who worked so hard to landmark the New York Theater District got deals wherever that they got huge air rights. All the air rights over those theaters that we worked hard to protect, those air rights have gone into this. And it's just going to be terrific.
Okay, so I think the question, I'm going to boil that down into a question, which is, what about the use of transferable development rights which protect one area but move the density onto another area?
They work, but they've got to have, most cities that do it have limits on it. You can buy them, you can sell them, you cannot pile up as many as you can conceivably buy. There is a percentage above what you could otherwise do, and it's usually 10 or 20%. So you don't have a building that's twice or 3 times as tall.
Actually, the building you're referring to is not using transferable development rights from theaters. It's a zoning lot merger. Very cleverly put together. We won't go into the details of all of
Okay, we're
all
going
of
to...
that. But to answer the question of it, city planning actually has done something sensible about development rights. Some of them now can be done through certification, which is as of right, pretty much as of right. So you now could actually scale it up. So if you want to take the unlimited amount of development rights and kind of pig out, you will go through an onerous process. But if you want to buy a little bit of the development rights, which is designed to make the theater owners whole, and that's the one that most developers actually use now because nobody wants to be tortured. Developers want to build buildings. They don't want to be tortured by a bureaucracy.
Okay, well, I want to thank our panelists who I think have given us a lot of good ideas about how we could make things better in New York. And so thank you so much for those ideas.
Thank you. Thank you.